Hello, everyone. Well, it's been a little bit of an odd day. If you've attempted to connect with the Mass this morning, and it should have been one because today is a feast day. It's a first class feast because of the fact that it is Saint Who. You figure it out. Think about it for a moment, and then we'll look at it at the very end. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your point of view, I am in Minnesota. And no, it's not so I can dig into my Scandinavian roots. And some of my relatives made their way from Sweden to Minnesota, nor is it because I am going to be going to a Lutefisk festival. But it has to do with the fact that I am doing a wedding. And the wedding is that of the late Bishop Parsons, who was my mentor and the sixth Bishop of Quincy, and I'm the eighth Bishop of Quincy. And his granddaughter asked me several years ago when Bishop Parsons died if I would be willing to do her wedding one day. And so I will, and I'll wear her grandfather's ring and vestments for it also, so that she can be connected. Now, what I'm talking about today is the third in a series. The first I discussed with you was about a will. This one, last week, I should say, in this series, was about a living will, or a durable power of attorney. And what I am going to discuss with you today is your funeral. Well, not yours personally, because actually, I don't want to be doing that this week. I'd like to kind of work through this wedding first. However, the reason why I believe that this is an important subject is because all too often what happens is we allow funeral directors or ill-informed family members to plan our funerals. And I don't think that's probably what we want. Let me put it this way. Remember how I told you that you don't want the state in which you live to receive your monies because you failed to have a will, because you're not convinced that they will, that is, the state in which you live, will distribute your assets the way you would like to have them distributed. So you cannot die without a will, what we call, as I said, intestate. The second one is you really just don't want anybody deciding your kind of end of life issues. That is, you don't want to discover that somebody other than your loving, wonderful family is making decisions about certain elements related to staying alive. Now, here I'm not talking about mercy, such as the issue of should one still have a feeding tube, or should one still have something like a intravenous for the purpose of receiving antibiotics or whatever it may be. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the various things, as I said last week, that you discover when you look at durable power of attorney, when you look at living wills, when you look at the matters such as DNR, do not resuscitate, all those kinds of things. Put differently, all of these elements, all these documents are in existence so that you are able to have some say into what's going on in time in your life when you may not be cognizant of it. You may not be aware of it. You may not be in a position to make some decisions. So, yes, we tell people what's on our mind, but if we don't write it down, in the end, it's one person's word against another. Now, that brings us to the issue of funerals, doesn't it? Now, there's a time when this would have been a very straightforward, easy thing to determine. In an age where there were no cremations, in an age where people's way of dealing with death in terms of the viewing meant that they would go to the house of the deceased, and they would go into that person's house and they would see the person who had died lying in state, as it were, in their own house, and then they would go to the church a few days later and have the requiem, the funeral, in the church. It was all relatively straightforward. Of course, it's always that issue, isn't it? And that is, what dictates the way things are done? Well, I like to explain to people what I call TTC. Capital T tradition would be that which has been given to us by God and received by the church, and that the church has upheld. That's capital T tradition. That's not, as you hear some Christians say, just a bunch of man-made ideas and traditions. No, I'm talking about a living tradition that has been enshrined in the church. In fact, there's 7 ecumenical councils that dealt with certain matters related to capital T tradition. Now, small t tradition oftentimes is that which is generally done in a wider sense, that is, traditions that are carried on, traditions that are conveyed, traditions that are, in fact, what's been done, let us say, in numerous generations in our families. I mean, that's fine. Then we get to see customs. Now, as I've explained to you, I'm in Minnesota to do the wedding of the granddaughter of Bishop Parsons. Here in Minnesota, the customs are different from when I lived in Western Pennsylvania or Kansas, or living in Texas, or living in Long Island, or living in Illinois. The customs vary from place to place. And that same thing can be said about funerals. Many of the things that people hold up as being absolutely capital T or even small t are really in the area of custom. However, circumstances have now changed that mean that you're now seeing a whole wide range of the way in which funerals are being done. Now, for example, a man called me yesterday to tell me that his mother had died. In the process, I simply said, is there anything that we can do apart from the obvious? Pray for her, pray for you. He said, well, no, she willed her body to medical science, and they've already come and picked up her body. Well, you know, that really wasn't an option at one time, but maybe that's an option for you. Maybe you say, no, what happens to my body is so insignificant and inconsequential that as soon as I die, I want my body being removed by the appropriate people to take it to the appropriate place so that medical science can do whatever medical science needs to do. Well, I'm not here to tell you that's wrong. I'm here to tell you that obviously that's an option. But I have a hunch that if you think that's not something you want, and you have 3 relatives who think that would be a great idea, I don't believe that people come back and haunt us. But if that's so contrary to anything you would ever want, why would 3 people have the right to be able to decide to do something like that? But if you don't write something down, you consider some of the possibilities that might occur. For example, last week in talking about various directives, I indicated that you may very well say that upon your death you would like the organs that are appropriately then used for other people to be used for other people. I mean, that's an option. I understand that. That really does go within what we talked about last week. But when it comes to a funeral, now we're in a very different set of circumstances. Now, first and foremost, let me tell you this. Just as I told you that a will prevents the state from being able to make decisions for you, I want you to know that funeral directors work for you and your family. You don't work for the funeral director. And the reason I say that is because I'm going to be very, very blunt with you. If you've decided that you wanted to have a traditional funeral, now let me lay out what I mean by traditional funeral, because it will vary from place to place. Namely, person dies, body is taken to the funeral home, ostensibly. I mean, not everybody does it right on site in the funeral home. Embalming takes place. Clothing has been selected. Person is to be in a casket. Somewhere, someplace, viewing takes place. 1 day, 2 days, who knows? And then it's the day of the funeral. Casket's closed. Funeral takes place in the church. Go to the cemetery. Body is placed in the ground. I mean, that's a fairly traditional pattern that most of us would identify, isn't it? I mean, it really is what I guess I would say the prevailing tradition that does exist. But here's the situation. The family now goes and sits down with the funeral director to discuss the funeral. Yes, it's determined body will be embalmed, or it's determined body will be cremated. Do you want your family to make that choice? And just because you told a relative that that's what you wanted was cremation instead of being in a casket and having the casket interred in the ground? I mean, do you really want somebody else to make that decision? Okay. So next what we have is the funeral director then takes us into the room to show us all the wonderful caskets that are there. And those caskets, you may very well say, that's the one I want over there because I think the lining inside really matches Mom's eyes really well. In case you haven't noticed, Mom's eyes probably are going to be closed. I mean, I hope so, in the casket. So you may very well like a particular interior, or you may like a particular casket, but the question you have to ask yourself, did Mom want much of that money to be spent on the most expensive casket that's in the room? Because oftentimes what a funeral director will say is, you have to understand, you owe it to your mom to give her the best that you possibly can. Well, fair enough if that's what Mom said, but if that's not what Mom said, how do you know unless it's all written down and you know it for a fact? Now what's fun is you oftentimes hear somebody say, I heard Mom say that she wanted a wooden casket. Well, maybe what Mom meant by wooden casket is different from what the funeral director wanted. Because if you say wooden casket to most funeral directors, they're going to take you into a room and show you their mahogany casket, which is 10 times better than any furniture Mom ever had in her house, and very expensive. In other words, a very simple metal casket, so to speak, is cheaper than one of those very well done and polished caskets made out of mahogany. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Many funeral homes have another casket, and it's not in the main casket room. And what it is a wooden casket that is then covered with cloth so that it looks like it's a finished casket, but it is in fact a wood casket. Now the funeral director will oftentimes say, I would never recommend that to anybody, and certainly I would never allow my mother to be buried in that casket because water would seep in. Now I want you to think that one through with me, folks. Water seeping into a casket that's underground. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Now the next thing I want you to think about is they'll ask you about a vault. Yeah, vault. Now some cemeteries require a vault, most of them do today. And that's to prevent sinking, which means that it's put in the ground, the casket is placed down, a lid is put on top, the dirt is then put on top. Now, when the funeral director talks with you about a vault, here's the way it goes. You can get yourself fiberglass with a fiberglass lid, or you can even get one that has some metal in it with a metal lid, because once again, the funeral director may very well say, you don't want water seeping into this. Once again, I have to ask the question, really? Okay. Now, let's say you are in a situation where they require a vault, and you say, I just want the simplest one. I mean, a vault is a vault. If you require it in the cemetery, fair enough, casket goes down, lid puts on. But wait. The funeral director will be happy to design a lid for you for the vault. And you can have all sorts of pretty things put on it, dates, places, whatever you want on it. Now, I want you to ask yourself this question, too. How long is that lid visible? Well, many people leave the graveside once the casket's put in the vault and don't wait for the lid to be put on. So maybe some will stick around and see the lid being put on the vault, but the next thing you know, here comes the dirt. So what happens to all those nice little things that we put on there? Gone in a few moments. And is that really what mom would want? So one of the things that I would recommend to you from the very beginning is to go in the following order. And I will tell you this. In our book, To God Be the Glory, published by the Parish Press, I've written a whole section on everything I've just told you. The forms, the things you could fill out, all related to the cemetery and the funeral home. All of that. Because remember, you are now placed in the most vulnerable situation you may be in to make decisions in a matter of moments. Cemetery, funeral home, embalm or not embalm, cremate or not cremate, fanciest casket available, basic casket, viewing for 3 days, no viewing. On and on the list goes with all of the things that you may or may not want. Now, if you're Jewish and watching this, you're in a good position because you'll get buried before sundown, so don't even worry about what I'm having to say. But if you're a Christian, you have more options than you could possibly imagine. So my suggestion to you is get forms like the ones that we have in To God Be the Glory and fill them all out. Now the question would be this: who gets those? Well, pre-planning a funeral with a funeral home that you like is not a bad way to go, to be honest. I mean, if you know you're going to be living at such and such a place for the remainder of your life, and you know a funeral home and you like them, you can go there and pre-plan with all this information. You take the forms home. You yourself can sit down and write them all up. Then my suggestion is have them all notarized with a copy in your safe, a copy in your executor's safe, a copy with your power of attorney, a copy with the church. I mean, you can't make too many copies. Now, here's the problem. You may say, give it to my executor. But you do remember that your executor can't function until your will has been probated and it's in place, right? So that means there's this awkward space of time. So make sure that you have a power of attorney right now. So that power of attorney may be the same as the executor, but maybe not. So make sure if it's two different people that they like each other. So let's go to the next phase now. You've gotten all of your paperwork that you want to have. It has all the data in there. What kind of data you're going to have in there? Everything I just said, namely about what you want as it relates to a funeral home, with all the options there. I have more I can tell you, which I will do at another time, but I'm just trying to get the subject rolling for you. So my suggestion is you consider going to see a funeral director right now, and that you get the forms that they need. You look them over, and then I will help you with the next phase in a few minutes as to what you'll need besides that. Now, what you're going to need in there, if you're planning somebody else's funeral, let's say you had to go to the funeral home, and now you're going to be asked so many different questions you won't believe it. Why? You're going to be asked those questions because some of it has to be for the death certificates. So you get the basic information for the death certificate, and keep this in mind. Don't order one death certificate because nobody accepts a Xerox copy of a death certificate. So take all of the various pension plans, insurance plans, all the things you can think of, the bank, your house, your automobiles, if you have all these things financed, you're going to need to have death certificates for all of those folks. Plus your children probably ought to all have one. My advice, never get fewer than 10 death certificates. Can you get more made? Yes, you can get more made. But remember, you can't Xerox them. So you have to go to the funeral director, ask for more death certificates, and guess what? If life is going great, you might get it in 2 weeks, or maybe it's going to be a month. Get more than you need, much better to have more for all the purposes. Next, what's going to happen is you can even go so far as to say that you want to have the clothing that you want to have wearing if you're going to be viewed, for example. In which case, my suggestion is get the clothing together now, for goodness sakes, if you're so inclined, unless you think it's morbid. And then put it in a plastic bag, or, one of those bags you can put clothing in with a zipper, and put on there for the funeral home. Or you can actually take the clothing to the funeral home and have it there for them if you like it. Now, here's the next thing I need to explain to you. Remember the good old days when you used to be able to pick your funeral director on the basis of you liked him because you met him someplace? I see Lois Jean is on this call, and she and I are from the same town, and we used to have a saying. We had several funeral homes, but it went like this. Got a body? Go Waddy. Need a date? Go to Fate. Are you skinny? Go to Finney. Well, those were the three main funeral homes in the general area where we lived, and we kind of had a little fun with having a little rhyme to go with it. But here's the thing you need to understand. There are hardly any more family-owned, independent funeral homes left. Even though they still have the name, you can be sure that some conglomerate has purchased them. Dignity, Legacy, whatever one it is. So if you think you're going to a funeral home because you happen to like the funeral director whom you went to school with, ask the question first, who owns you? And even though you may see a relative of his in the business, he probably is working for this large group. So if you think you're going to a personal funeral home, ask a lot of questions first. And you may decide that you still like it, no problem. But just don't expect that if it's bought up by a corporation that you will get the exact same treatment that you received when it was owned by somebody you met at Rotary Club. So, next, after you have all the things planned that you want, here's the other thing that's tricky today. Obituaries. It used to be that there was a standard for obituaries. Folks, you could write any kind of comical thing you want today, and you're paying for it anyway. Obituaries are very, very expensive. It's just the way it's all set up today. And of course, most people would say, I want my obituary placed in the following newspapers, and you noted it. Good. I mean, I'm glad. But keep in mind that will be coming out of the money that is left, and it is pricey, and you get to decide what you want in your obituary. Unless you want somebody writing something silly about you, I'd write your own obituary now. I really would. And while you may speak in glowing terms about yourself, no, I'm just kidding. But what I mean to say is, somebody is going to be charged with having to sit down and write your obituary someday. And that could be terribly difficult. And when you look at some of the things that are being written today in obituaries, I don't know that I would want somebody writing my obituary to talk about how I danced and sang my way through this world, and now I'm dancing and singing in heaven. I mean, I'm not sure I really want that in an obituary, but that's what's happening. So decide the newspapers, write up your own obituary, and for goodness sakes, have all the information available to those who are working with it, simply because you're asking somebody to write about you who may not have the necessary facts. And don't assume that just because you trust your child so very much, that your child knows what to do. Remember this, you may outlive your child. Now what do you do? So be very well prepared. So that's the information I'm advocating that you get together now for yourself, and also fill out all those forms and share them with the various people in your life. Because here's what happens. This has happened to me on numerous occasions. People have found somebody's burial plans and wishes after the funeral. And they've discovered that they didn't do anything that mom or dad wanted, because they did what they wanted to do. And so in terms of keeping mom's wishes, they didn't. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't want to, it's just because perhaps they were in one of those families like many people are in. You never talk about death. You never talk about cemeteries. You never talk about funeral homes. You never talk about anything related to the funeral. Why? Why? I mean, it's like not a subject to be discussed. But guess what? You can't avoid it. One day you'll have to discuss it, whether you feel like it or not. And somebody will be discussing it about you. Now, I've left the church part till the end. As I said to you, it used to be without question the fact that several days in the funeral home, viewings, for example, or in the person's home years ago, and then to the church. And then at the church, regular funeral. And then from the church to the cemetery. In many instances, there were church cemeteries right next door to the church, so that was a simple matter. But folks, don't expect that just because mom says she wanted to be buried at such and such a cemetery, that she actually had the title for her cemetery plot. You know, you get titles. But sometimes people get confused too, and then you find out mom never had such a thing. Or you may say, bury me at such and such a cemetery, but have you checked lately to discover how much a cemetery plot costs? Or have you checked lately to see if the one you thought you owned you really owed, and then discover you don't? I'll let you in on a little secret here. Because of the number of people who are married and divorced today, remarried, the question that comes up sometimes is, where are we going to bury mom, because she divorced dad and she married Sammy? Well, maybe mom and your dad purchased 2 plots at such and such a cemetery, and Sammy and the rest of the family sure don't want mom to be buried next to first husband. So guess what happens? People are now selling their cemetery plots that they had purchased with another spouse, or that they simply don't want anymore or don't need because they've moved out of the state. You just go online. You can actually purchase cemetery plots in a variety of cemeteries by going on and asking which ones are for sale. And when I say for sale, I'm not talking about the ones that the cemetery wants to sell you for an inflated amount of money. For example, if you really wanted to go buy a cemetery plot today, you better have at least $4,000 ready to roll for just one. And so do all this advance work, or otherwise that marvelous amount of money you think you're leaving to somebody, well, that's going to be going for other expenses related to the funeral. Now, the church itself should be equipped to be able to do requiems, our parlance, or funeral liturgies. We should be equipped to do, and we usually are. But those of us who are ordained are sometimes very confused because we think we know what the parishioner said he or she wanted, but then the kids come in and say, that's not what we want. And that's because papers were not filed with the church. So let me ask you this question. Let's go back. Several weeks ago, do you have a will? If you don't, you're in trouble. That's just the way it is. 2, do you have all the paperwork done for durable power of attorney, living will? If you don't, hey, you're in trouble. I mean, you'll die, that won't change it, but maybe some of the things related to how you die are changed by it. 3, do you have all your funeral plans together? Not only with the funeral home, but with your family and with the church. If you don't, then don't expect anything. I mean, it's just that simple. And that's the beauty of the gift of free will that God has given us. We can choose not to do certain things, and then we just have to know we live with the implications of not doing it. Or we can choose to do something, and then people will be feeling much more at ease. So, church, what's that look like? Well, the traditional, back to the small t, would be that the body is taken to the church. We put a pall over top of the casket for a very simple reason, so nobody will know whether that was a pauper or a rich person. Everybody in the church gets to have the same pall. And so nobody can go around and talk about, oh, wonderful funeral, nice casket, things like that. Covered in church. Caskets can't be opened in churches also because that part of the reality has concluded, namely an opportunity to have a viewing. Plus, in our tradition, if a casket is in a particular place, we always have a kneeler, and we always have candles, and we almost always have a crucifix in it. If you don't like it, say you don't want it. But why do we have a kneeler? Well, because the culture in which we live today, which has done away with kneelers, they go to check out the body, to do a viewing. Whereas in our tradition, we go to say prayers for the person and to offer prayers to God for the family. So a kneeler is there because our expectation is that people are going to be praying. The culture's expectation is that people are going to go do a viewing. Now, let's go to the next part. Funeral, in our tradition, is not a celebration of life. Celebration of life is a brand new phenomenon that seems to have borrowed a great deal from the Irish concept of a wake. I think an Irish wake is a marvelous thing to do. Party, celebration, all those kinds of things are marvelous opportunities. People stand up at the wake, say something about their friend, missing them. So, it can be a wonderful way to celebrate. But folks, that's not what we do at funerals. Funerals are not liturgical wakes. Funerals are a place where we get to do, and here's the issue. If anybody ever says to you, a funeral is for the survivors, then they've already gotten caught up in the culture. The funeral is not for the survivors. Any more than worship on a Sunday morning is to keep everybody in the church entertained. Prayer is directed to God. Therefore, funerals are directed to God, where we pray for the person who has died, and we pray in the words of the scriptures for the person who has died. That God will hold them. Nothing separates us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And that's why you get to select from a list which lessons you want to have read at your funeral, so that people can hear with their own ears what you believed and what the church teaches. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? On and on, all of the beautiful lessons from Holy Scriptures not only are a reflection of what you believe, but what the church has always believed, and it needs to be heard by some of the people in churches who don't believe. So, your funeral may be an opportunity for people to gather together and hear the Word of God in a way they've never heard it before. But it's including the people in the pews and the family, the mourners. It's not directed to them. Remember, that's the problem with this narcissistic culture that we find ourselves in today. Everything's all about me. Well, a funeral, is all about God. It's all about His love for you. It's all about Jesus coming into the world and telling us that death no longer is the final word. It's like St. Paul says, death has no longer dominion over us, meaning that Jesus' resurrection is now the story for a Christian. We can have eternal life in Jesus Christ. And so, hearing all the wonderful things that the departed person said, if you don't have a wake the night before, that's what you do at the reception afterwards. That's when people can stand up and they can read their recollections or do a eulogy. But the sermon at a funeral is supposed to be about Jesus and about His love for that person and for the remaining people who are there, so that they can leave the church with hope, a hope in the resurrection. And that, by the way, is countercultural. But if for some reason what you have in your mind is you like the new modern cultural type of funeral, you better write it up. Just have it all written up, exactly what you want. Even though the church will tell you what the nature of a Christian funeral is like apart from the culture, the church doesn't want to ignore some of the wishes you have. But one of the best things that a person can do is to make an appointment with their priest, sit down with the priest, plan the funeral with the priest. Once again, all those forms are in the book, To God Be the Glory. It's not a commercial announcement. It's just that one of the purposes of that book was to make things available to people that would be helpful, like filling out all of the forms that would be able to help others. Well, I'm going to pause there. Next week, I'm going to continue with you because that's a lot for you to digest in just a brief period of time. But I think that if you extracted anything from what I had to say today, it's this. Today, you have more options than you would have 40, 50 years ago, obviously. 2, write it down. 3, plan it with appropriate people. And finally, make sure that notarized copies go to the correct people. Now you say, why notarized copies? I'll tell you why. It's because somebody else can start writing down what they think that you wanted. So you need to have something that has a witness that this is what you want. Because in the end, folks, in the end, if you have some monies put aside, if you have insurance policies, that money is going to be used for your funeral. And you get to decide what you'd like to do in terms of those distributions. And just like in your own will that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, you get to say how you want to have the assets distributed. In your funeral, you need to be able to determine right up front what a funeral will cost and whether you'll even be able to afford such a thing. Or whether you would like very much for your children that you've left no money to have to pay for it themselves. I'm not saying it's that cold and cruel, but it happens. And I have to say, after 47 years as a priest, I've seen it happen. And I can also tell you this. I had to do a funeral myself. You know, you say, what does that mean? I mean, this person had nothing. And I happened to have in the parish where I was rector a place that had a cemetery. And I took another man with me and we dug a grave together. We took our shovels, we dug a grave. I'd done the funeral at the church. Several of us went to the cemetery and we buried the body in the ground because they grandfathered the old cemeteries in, didn't have to have a vault. And then I was able to get the casket donated by a local funeral home and was able to make sure that everything was done in order, and what was left I paid for out of my discretionary fund. Now, that's not a poor me story, by the way. It's simply me saying to you that if you want to make people's lives better, or at least as good, after you're gone and they're missing you, then please, please, please let everybody know what you would like. But don't do it off the top of your head. And remember again, if you don't plan your funeral, then you may very well have a funeral director telling you exactly what he or she want you or your survivors to do. God bless you. I'll say more about this next week, and pray for me here in Minnesota, where I am getting ready to go meet with the bride and the groom. God bless you.